It was just another evening on the road. The sun had started to dip low, casting long shadows across the quiet streets. Cars were moving steadily, most people heading home after a long day. Among them was a woman who had spent her day inside, a courtroom, calm, composed, and used to being in control. She wore her seatbelt like everyone else, kept both hands on the wheel, and followed the rules of the road. She wasn't speeding, she wasn't swerving. But still, behind her, red and blue lights blinked to life. A police car had pulled up behind her. The officer got out. He was white, mid-30s maybe, clean uniform, serious look. He walked up to the driver's side window. She rolled it down without hesitation. "License and registration," he said. She nodded, reached into the glove compartment, and handed him the documents. Her voice was calm. "Is everything okay, officer?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at the car. It was a luxury model, black, sleek, clearly expensive. He flipped through the paperwork but seemed distracted. "Where are you coming from?" he asked. She told him she was coming from work. Said she was a judge? He raised an eyebrow. Didn't seem to believe her. "I need to check something," he said, walking back to his car. A few seconds later, he radioed in the license plate, waited, then came back. Still holding her papers, he asked, "Do you mind stepping out for a second?" She hesitated. "Why? Did I do something wrong?" "You didn't," he said, "but I need to verify some things." She looked around. There were cars passing by. A few people had stopped nearby, curious about what was happening. One man even pulled out his phone, recording quietly. She stepped out, still polite. Still calm. He stood close. Not aggressive, but not exactly friendly either. "Who owns this car?" he asked. "I do," she said. "How'd you get it?" "I bought it." He gave her a look. Like he didn't believe that someone like her could afford a car like that. "Are you sure it's registered under your name?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "You just check that." He didn't respond, just stared at the car again. Then he motioned to another officer who had arrived moments earlier. "Let's run a VIN check," he said. The second officer opened the front hood and looked at the number stamped into the metal. They radioed it in too. More waiting. Meanwhile, she stood there, hands folded, watching, wondering why she was being treated like a suspect when all she did was roll through a stop sign. One of the bystanders finally spoke up. "Officer, why are you doing this?" he asked. "She says she owns the car. You checked the tags. Why is she still standing out here?" The first officer ignored him. The second one came back with the result. The car was registered properly. No flags, no stolen reports. Still, they didn't let her go right away. Instead, the first officer asked, "Can we search the car?" She shook her head. "No, officer. You don't have a reason to do that." He shrugged. "Just trying to be thorough." She stayed firm. "Then you'll need a warrant." That's when the tension really set in. The officer didn't push further, but he didn't apologize either. He just handed her back her license and registration. "You're free to go," he said. She took the papers, thanked him politely, and got back into her car. The engine hummed to life. She pulled away slowly, eyes on the road, heart beating faster than before. Behind her, the officer watched. So did the growing group of onlookers. And the man with the phone? He hadn't stopped recording. The video went up online within hours. Someone had uploaded it, probably the guy who recorded everything at the scene, and it spread like wildfire. Social media feeds lit up. People couldn't stop talking about it. In the clip, you could see her calm face as she answered questions from the officer. You could hear his voice, polite but firm, yet laced with doubt. The way he questioned her ownership of the car stood out most. "How'd you get it?" he asked, almost like he already knew what he thought the answer would be. Like he didn't believe someone like her, a black woman dressed professionally, could possibly own something so expensive. Comments flooded in. Some people defended the officer, saying he was just doing his job. Others were furious. They pointed out how unfair it all seemed. Why question someone who followed every rule? Why act like owning a luxury car was impossible for certain people? By morning, the story wasn't just online, it was everywhere. Newspapers picked it up. News channels played the video over and over again, adding commentary each time. Reporters scrambled to find more details. Who was the woman in the video? What did she do for a living? And why had this happened? Turns out, she wasn't just any woman. She was a judge. Not just a lawyer or someone involved in the legal system, a sitting circuit court judge. That made things even bigger. Now it wasn't just about one bad interaction between a citizen and the police. It was about power dynamics, respect, and whether authority figures treated others fairly based on their skin color. Her name stayed out of the headlines at first, but soon enough, people figured it out. She gave interviews because she knew the world was watching. Sitting tall in front of cameras, she spoke slowly and clearly. Her tone was steady, not angry. She didn't raise her voice or accuse anyone directly. Instead, she explained what happened, step by step, how she'd been driving home after a long day at work, how the officer pulled her over for something minor, how quickly the situation turned strange when he started doubting her word. "I've worked hard my entire life," she said during one interview. "I've earned everything I have. To stand there and have someone question that, not because of evidence but because of assumptions, is frustrating, but it's also disappointing." She paused then, letting her words sink in. Frustrating, disappointing. Those two words summed it all up perfectly. Meanwhile, the officer involved became the center of attention too. His department released a statement saying they were investigating the incident. They promised transparency and fairness. But the public wasn't convinced. Protesters gathered outside the police station, holding signs that read, "Justice for all," and "End racial profiling." Local leaders joined them, speaking passionately about equality and accountability. Back at the station, the officer faced tough questions from his superiors. Did he handle the situation correctly? Should he have let her go sooner? Was there bias in how he approached her? He tried explaining himself. Said he was suspicious because cars like hers often showed up in theft reports. Claimed he needed to double-check everything to make sure nothing illegal was going on. But no matter how many times he repeated those points, they didn't sound convincing anymore. People heard excuses, not explanations. As days passed, new information came out. A former colleague of the officer spoke anonymously to reporters. This person said the officer had made racially charged jokes in the past, comments about neighborhoods, stereotypes about wealth and race. Nothing serious enough to get him fired, but enough to raise eyebrows. That revelation shifted the narrative, again. Now it wasn't just about one traffic stop. It was about patterns, about systems, about whether people in positions of power held biases they weren't even aware of. Legal experts weighed in next. Lawyers talked about the rights of citizens during traffic stops. Civil rights advocates discussed the impact of racial profiling on communities. Even psychologists chimed in, explaining how unconscious biases shaped behavior without people realizing. Through all of this, the judge remained dignified. She didn't lash out or demand revenge. Instead, she used her platform to spark conversations. She visited community centers, schools, and churches, spoke to young people about resilience and perseverance, told them stories from her own life, how she grew up facing challenges but never let setbacks define her. One night, she appeared on a late-night talk show. The host asked her directly, "What do you want to happen now?" She smiled softly before answering. "I want us to learn," she said. "This isn't about me versus one officer. It's about understanding where we fall short as a society and working together to fix it. Accountability matters. So does empathy." Her words resonated deeply. Thousands of viewers messaged the show afterward, thanking her for handling the situation with grace, for refusing to let anger take over, for reminding everyone that change starts with conversation, but not everyone agreed. Critics argued that focusing on one incident ignored bigger issues. Some accused her of using her status to gain sympathy. Others claimed the officer was being unfairly targeted, that mistakes happen and shouldn't ruin careers. Still, the momentum kept building. Petitions circulated online calling for reforms in policing practices. City council meetings filled up with residents demanding action. Local officials promised changes, though skeptics wondered if promises would lead to real results. At the heart of it all was the video. People kept sharing it, discussing it, dissect newspapers' articles inspired by it. Each replay brought fresh reactions. Some felt sadness, others felt anger. A few felt defensive, but everyone felt something. And that emotion pushed the conversation forward. Behind closed doors, the officers struggled with the fallout. Friends stopped reaching out. Neighbors avoided eye contact. His family fielded awkward questions whenever they went out. He hadn't expected any of this when he pulled her over that evening. Thought it was just another routine stop. Never imagined it would spiral into a national debate. For the judge, life moved on, but differently. Strangers recognized her in grocery stores and thanked her for speaking out. Colleagues offered support, though some whispered concerns about her becoming too public. She understood their hesitation, but chose to focus on the bigger picture. If sharing her experience helped even one person feel seen or heard, she believed it was worth it. And so the story continued unfolding. Conversations deepened. Questions lingered. No easy answers emerged. But one thing was clear. What happened that night on the quiet suburban street wouldn't fade anytime soon. It had become part of something larger, a movement toward understanding, accountability, and hope. As the days turned into weeks, the fallout from that evening kept growing. The incident wasn't just a local story anymore. It was everywhere. People across the country were talking about it. Some saw it as proof of systemic problems in law enforcement. Others thought it was being blown out of proportion. Either way, everyone had an opinion. The officer involved found himself at the center of a storm he couldn't escape. His department announced they were launching an internal investigation. They promised transparency but gave no timeline for when results would come out. In the meantime, he was placed on administrative leave. No badge, no gun, just waiting, stuck in limbo while the world debated his actions. For him, life became surreal. Friends who used to joke around with him now avoided calling. Neighbors whispered behind closed doors. Even his own family struggled. His wife stopped taking walks around the block because people stared too much. His kids came home from school, saying classmates had called their dad racist. He tried telling himself it would pass, but deep down, he knew this wasn't something that disappeared overnight. Meanwhile, the judge's story took on a life of its own. She became more than just someone caught up in an unfortunate situation. To many, she was a symbol, a reminder of how far society still needed to go. People admired her calmness during the stop, her refusal to let anger take over afterward. When she spoke publicly, crowds listened closely. Her words carried weight not just because of what happened to her, but because of who she was, a respected figure in the justice system herself. One day she sat down for an interview with a well-known journalist. The setting was simple, a small studio with soft lighting, but the conversation felt monumental. The journalist asked tough questions, pushing her to share raw emotions. At one point she paused, looking away from the camera for a moment. "It's hard," she admitted. "You spend your whole career working to uphold fairness, to treat people equally under the law. Then something like this happens, and you realize some people don't see you the same way. They see stereotypes instead of facts, assumptions instead of truth." Her voice cracked slightly, but she didn't cry. Instead, she leaned forward, speaking directly into the camera. "I'm not special because I'm a judge. I'm a person, just like anyone else. What happened to me could happen to anyone who looks like me. That's what scares me most." Those words hit hard. Viewers felt them deeply. Social media exploded again, this time filled with messages of support. Hashtags like "respect and dignity" and "justice for all" trended for days. People shared personal stories of similar encounters with law enforcement, moments where they felt judged not by their actions but by their appearance. Back at the police station, things weren't going smoothly either. Internal affairs investigators dug into the officer's past. They reviewed body cam footage from previous stops, interviewed colleagues, and examined complaints filed against him over the years. Most cases had been minor, speeding tickets, noise violations. But one stood out. A year earlier, a black teenager claimed the officer had treated him rudely during a routine traffic stop. Nothing came of it back then, but now it raised eyebrows. Then there was the anonymous tip. Someone close to the officer reached out to reporters, claiming they'd heard him make racially insensitive comments in the past. Not outright hate speech, but little remarks here and there. Jokes about neighborhoods, stereotypes about wealth and race. Enough to make coworkers uncomfortable, but not enough to report officially. When that information came out, it shifted the narrative again. Critics argued it showed a pattern, a mindset that influenced his behavior during the stop. Supporters countered that everyone made offhand comments sometimes. It didn't mean he was racist. The debate raged on, dividing communities further. Local. Leaders stepped in, trying to bridge the gap. The mayor held a press conference flanked by the police chief and other officials. Standing behind a podium, he looked serious, almost weary. What happened that night was unacceptable, he said. No matter the circumstances, no one should be treated the way she was. We're committed to making sure this doesn't happen again. He outlined plans for reform: mandatory bias training for all officers, stricter guidelines for traffic stops, and increased use of body cameras. The crowd listening cheered. Those skeptics wondered if these promises would lead to real change or just fade away like so many others before. At the same time, tension simmered within the police force. Officers split into camps. Some defended their colleague, arguing he'd been doing his job. Others quietly agreed changes were needed. Morale plummeted as mistrust grew between the department and the community it served. Through it all, the judge stayed focused. She returned to work, presiding over cases as usual. But outside the courtroom, she remained active. She attended town hall meetings, listened to residents' concerns, and pushed for accountability. One night, she even joined a panel discussion with former police officers, activists, and academics. Together, they talked about ways to rebuild trust between law enforcement and marginalized communities. During the event, a young woman stood up and asked a question. Her voice trembled as she spoke. How do we protect ourselves? How do we make sure this doesn't keep happening? The judge thought for a moment before answering. It starts with speaking up, she said. When something feels wrong, say something. Record it if you can. Share your story. Change won't happen overnight, but every voice matters. The room fell silent after that. Everyone seemed to understand the weight of her words. Behind the scenes, the legal process continued. Lawyers representing both sides prepared arguments. Civil rights organizations filed motions demanding answers. Activists organized rallies, keeping pressure on city officials. Meanwhile, filmmakers began working on a documentary, hoping to capture the full scope of what happened and why it mattered. For the officer, the wait dragged on. He spent hours replaying the stop in his mind, wondering what he could have done differently. Had he misread the situation, been too quick to doubt her, or was he simply following protocol? One evening, sitting alone in his living room, he picked up the newspaper. There she was again, her face on the front page, smiling confidently despite everything. He stared at the photo for a long time, feeling a mix of guilt and frustration. He hadn't meant to cause harm, yet here they were, caught in a cycle neither of them could control. As the sun set outside, casting shadows across the room, he realized something important. This wasn't just about him or her. It was about systems, about history, about biases, embedded so deeply that even good intentions couldn't always fix them. And somewhere, miles away, the judge sat in her office, writing notes for her next speech. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she also knew one thing for certain. Silence never solved anything, so she kept speaking, kept fighting, and hoped others would join her along the way. The investigation dragged on longer than anyone expected. Weeks turned into months, and the tension in the community didn't ease up. People were tired of waiting, tired of debating, tired of feeling like nothing was changing. But they couldn't look away. Every update, every rumor, every new detail kept them glued to their screens. For the officer involved, life felt like it had been put on hold. He spent his days at home, scrolling through news articles and comments online. Some defended him, saying he was just doing his job. Others called him names, accused him of being part of a broken system. The weight of it all pressed down on him. He stopped sleeping well. His wife noticed how quiet he'd become, how distant. She tried talking to him, but he shrugged her off. "It's not about me," he said one night, staring at the ceiling. "It's about everything." She didn't argue. She knew he was right, but she also knew he was struggling more than he let on. So she sat beside him, holding his hand without saying a word. Sometimes silence was better than answers. Meanwhile, the judge continued to speak out. She wasn't just giving interviews anymore. She was showing up everywhere. Community centers, schools, even churches. Her message stayed the same. Accountability matters. Justice isn't just for some people. It's for everyone. And change starts with listening. One afternoon, she visited a high school auditorium packed with students. They were young, curious, full of questions. One boy raised his hand hesitantly. "What if we're scared?" he asked. "What if we don't know what to do when something bad happens?" She smiled softly before answering. "Being scared is okay," she said. "I was scared that night. But here's the thing. Fear doesn't have to stop you. Speak up anyway. Tell your story. Find people who will listen. Together, we can make things better." The room erupted in applause. Teachers wiped tears from their eyes. Students nodded, inspired by her courage. Afterward, a group of kids surrounded her, asking for advice, sharing their own experiences. She listened patiently, nodding along, reminding them they weren't alone. Back at the police department, Internal Affairs finally wrapped up its investigation. Their report landed on the chief's desk late one Friday evening. By Monday morning, the findings were public. The officer had violated department policy during the traffic stop. Specifically, he hadn't followed proper procedures when questioning the driver and requesting a search without probable cause. The fallout was immediate. Calls for his termination flooded in. Protesters gathered outside the station again, holding signs that read "Accountability now" and "No more excuses." Reporters camped out front, waiting for any scrap of information, but not everyone agreed with the decision. Supporters argued the officer was being made an example of, that mistakes happened and shouldn't end careers. Online forums lit up with heated debates. Some praised the ruling as a step toward justice. Others condemned it as unfair punishment. Amid the chaos, the officer faced disciplinary hearings. Lawyers presented arguments on both sides. His defense team claimed he acted based on reasonable suspicion, citing previous car thefts in the area. They argued he wasn't targeting her because of her race. He was following protocol. Opposing counsel countered with evidence from the investigation. They highlighted patterns in his behavior, pointing to past incidents and anonymous tips about racially charged remarks. They emphasized the impact of his actions, not just on the judge but on the wider community. The hearing lasted for days. Witnesses testified. Experts weighed in. Finally, the panel reached a verdict: suspension without pay for 6 months, mandatory, bias training, and a formal reprimand added to his record. When the decision came down, reactions were mixed. Activists celebrated it as progress, proof that accountability existed, even if it wasn't perfect. Critics dismissed it as too lenient, arguing it didn't go far enough to address systemic issues. For the officer, it felt like a loss either way. Suspended, scrutinized, and branded as part of a larger problem he didn't fully understand. As for the judge, she refused to let anger take over. Instead, she focused on solutions. She partnered with local organizations to create workshops aimed at building trust between law enforcement and communities. She worked with city officials to draft new policies, ensuring transparency during traffic stops and requiring body cameras to be active at all times. Her efforts earned praise, but they also sparked controversy. Some colleagues questioned whether she should stay involved given her personal connection to the case. Wasn't there a conflict of interest? Shouldn't someone neutral handle these reforms? She addressed the concerns head-on during a press conference. Standing tall behind a podium, she spoke firmly but kindly. "I'm not doing this because of what happened to me," she said. "I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do. If my experience helps spark change, then I'll use it. We can't afford to waste opportunities like this." Her honesty won over skeptics. Even those who disagreed with her methods respected her determination. Slowly but surely, momentum built. Workshops launched. Policies changed. Conversations deepened. Still, challenges remained. Not everyone embraced the reforms. Some officers resisted new guidelines, grumbling about unnecessary bureaucracy. Others worried about being punished for honest mistakes. Community members, meanwhile, wondered if real change was possible, or if this was just another temporary fix. Through it all, the judge stayed grounded. She reminded herself why she started this journey in the first place. It wasn't about revenge or proving a point. It was about creating a world where no one had to feel the way she did that night, doubted, dismissed, dehumanized. One evening, she attended a town hall meeting hosted by local leaders. Residents filled the room, eager to share their thoughts. A woman stood up, clutching a microphone tightly. "I want to thank you," she said, her voice shaking. "You've shown us that it's okay to stand up for ourselves, that we deserve respect." The judge nodded, blinking back tears. "Thank you," she replied simply. "That means more than you know." Afterward, as she walked to her car, a man approached her. He looked nervous, fidgeting with his hat. "I'm sorry," he blurted out. "About what happened? About everything." She stopped, surprised. Then she smiled gently. "It's okay," she said. "We're all learning. What matters is what we do next." He nodded, looking relieved. As she drove away, she thought about the road ahead. It wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks, arguments, moments of doubt. But she believed in the power of persistence, of hope. And somewhere, miles away, the officer sat in his living room, flipping through channels. News anchors still talked about the case. Commentators analyzed every angle. He muted the TV, leaning back on the couch. His wife glanced over. "Are you okay?" He sighed. "I don't know," he admitted. "But maybe I need to figure that out." Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky orange and pink. Life moved on, messy and complicated, but moving forward nonetheless. Months had passed since the incident, but its ripple effects were far from over. The city was still buzzing with conversations about accountability, trust, and reform. People wanted answers, and not just for this one case. They wanted to know how to prevent something like it from happening again. The officer sat alone most days now, his suspension stretching longer than he'd expected. He spent hours replaying the traffic stop in his mind, dissecting every word he'd said, every action he'd taken. Sometimes, late at night, he'd pull up the video online and watch it again. Her calm face, his clipped tone, the growing tension, as bystanders recorded everything. He tried convincing himself it wasn't personal, that he'd been following protocol, doing what any officer would do in a similar situation. But deep down, he knew there was more to it. Something about her car, her demeanor, the way she carried herself made him hesitate, made him question things he shouldn't have questioned. And now, here he was, suspended, scrutinized, and struggling to make sense of it all. His wife noticed the toll it was taking. She saw the dark circles under his eyes, heard him muttering in his sleep. One evening, after another long day of silence, she finally spoke up. "You can't keep running from this," she said softly. "You have to face it." He looked at her, surprised. "How? What am I supposed to say?" "I don't know," she admitted. "But staying quiet isn't helping. Maybe you should talk to someone who understands." Her words stuck with him. For days, he thought about them, weighing the idea. Finally, he reached out to an old colleague, a retired officer who'd worked in community relations. The man agreed to meet him for coffee. They sat across from each other at a quiet cafe, steam rising from their cups. At first, the conversation stayed surface level. Weather, sports, anything but the elephant in the room. Then slowly, the topic shifted. "What do you think I did wrong?" the officer asked, his voice low. The retired cop sighed, leaning back in his chair. "It's not about right or wrong," he said. "It's about perspective. You saw a luxury car and assumed something didn't add up, but she saw a routine stop turn into something else entirely." The officer frowned. "I wasn't trying to profile her." "Maybe not consciously," the older man replied. "But biases don't always announce themselves. They sneak in when we least expect it." The words hit hard. The officer felt a mix of guilt and frustration, but couldn't deny the truth in them. He nodded slowly, absorbing the lesson. Meanwhile, the judge continued pushing for change. She knew reforms wouldn't happen overnight, but she refused to let momentum fade. She partnered with local organizations to host workshops aimed at bridging gaps between law enforcement and marginalized communities. Officers attended alongside residents, sitting together in rooms filled with tension and hope. One session stood out. A young woman raised her hand, her voice trembling as she spoke. "My brother got pulled over last year," she said, "for no reason, just because of where we live. He hasn't trusted cops since." An officer sitting nearby leaned forward, listening intently. "I'm sorry that happened," he said. "Not all of us are bad. Some of us really want to help." She hesitated, then nodded. "I believe you, but it's hard to tell the difference sometimes." The exchange sparked a deeper conversation. People shared stories, painful ones, hopeful ones, complicated ones. By the end of the session, there was a fragile sense of understanding. Not solutions exactly, but a starting point. Back at the station, changes were underway. New policies required officers to wear body cameras at all times, with strict penalties for turning them off during interactions. Training programs focused on de-escalation techniques and recognizing unconscious bias. Supervisors conducted regular reviews to ensure compliance. Some officers embraced the changes, seeing them as opportunities to rebuild trust. Others resisted, grumbling about unnecessary rules and paperwork. Tensions simmered, but progress, even slow progress, was progress nonetheless. The judge stayed visible throughout it all. She gave speeches, wrote op-eds, and met with lawmakers to advocate for statewide reforms. Her efforts earned praise, though not everyone agreed with her methods. Critics accused her of stepping outside her role as a judge, arguing she should focus on courtrooms instead of policymaking. She addressed the criticism head-on during a televised interview. "This isn't about my role," she said firmly. "It's about responsibility. If my experience helps spark change, then I'll use it. We owe it to ourselves and to future generations to try." Her words resonated deeply. Thousands of viewers messaged the show afterward, thanking her for using her platform to push for justice. Even skeptics found themselves admiring her determination. As weeks turned into months, the documentary crew working on the film gained access to key players involved in the case. They interviewed the judge, capturing her reflections on resilience and perseverance. They spoke with activists, lawyers, and community members, piecing together a fuller picture of what happened and why it mattered. When they approached the officer, he hesitated at first, but eventually he agreed to sit down with them. Sitting in front of the camera, he looked nervous but sincere. "I never meant to hurt anyone," he said. "I thought I was doing my job. Now I realize I have a lot to learn." His honesty surprised viewers when the clip aired later. Some praised him for owning up to his mistakes. Others dismissed it as too little, too late. Either way, it added another layer to the story, a reminder that growth often starts with discomfort. Through it all, the judge remained steadfast. She understood the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks, arguments, moments of doubt. But she believed in the power of persistence, of hope. One evening, she attended a community event hosted by local leaders. Residents gathered in a park, sharing food and laughter. Kids played tag while parents chatted nearby. It felt normal And that was the point. A man approached her, holding a plate of food. "Thank you," he said simply. "For everything." She smiled, touched by the gesture. "Thank you," she replied, "for sticking with us through all of this." As the sun set, painting the sky orange and pink, she stood watching the crowd. Families laughed together. Strangers struck up conversations. Slowly but surely, connections formed. Somewhere, miles away, the officer watched the same sunset from his backyard. His suspension was nearing its end, though he wasn't sure what came next. Would people trust him again? Could he rebuild his career? He didn't have answers yet, but for the first time in months he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, if he kept learning, kept listening, it wasn't too late to change. And somewhere in between, the city moved forward. Messy, complicated, human. The months rolled by, and life in the city began to settle into a new rhythm. The incident that had once dominated headlines slowly faded from the front pages, but its impact lingered. Conversations about accountability, trust, and reform continued. Quietly, steadily, like a river carving its way through rock. For the officer, returning to work felt strange. His suspension was over, but things weren't the same. Fellow officers treated him differently, some with sympathy, others with distance. Residents eyed him cautiously, unsure whether he'd changed, or if he was still the same person who had doubted the judge that night. He tried to prove himself. He followed every new policy to the letter. Body camera always on, de-escalation techniques prioritized, respectful tone during stops. But old habits were hard to break. Sometimes he caught himself hesitating before approaching certain cars, questioning his own instincts. Was he being fair, or was bias creeping back in? One evening, after a long shift, he stopped by a coffee shop near the station. A man behind the counter recognized him. Their eyes met briefly, and the officer braced himself for anger, or worse, silence. Instead, the man nodded politely and handed him his drink. "Thanks," the officer said, surprised. "No problem," the man replied. "We're all just trying to get through this." The words stayed with him as he drove home. For the first time in months, he felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe rebuilding trust wasn't impossible. Maybe it started with small moments like this. Meanwhile, the judge kept pushing forward. She didn't slow down, not even when critics accused her of overstepping her role. If anything, their doubts fueled her determination. She believed change required more than speeches and workshops. It needed action. She worked closely with city officials to implement reforms beyond policing. Schools introduced programs teaching students about systemic bias and resilience. Local businesses pledged to hire more diverse staff and support underrepresented communities. Even churches hosted discussions about race, privilege, and empathy. Her efforts earned national recognition. News outlets profiled her as a leader in the fight for justice. Invitations poured in, from conferences, universities, even government panels. She accepted some, declined others, careful not to lose sight of why she started this journey in the first place. One day she received an invitation that made her pause. A filmmaker wanted to screen the documentary about her experience at a major film festival. They hoped she'd attend, maybe even participate in a panel afterward. She agreed, though nerves bubbled inside her. The thought of reliving that night on a big screen wasn't easy, but she reminded herself why it mattered. Stories had power. They could educate, inspire, and heal. And hers wasn't just her own anymore. It belonged to everyone who saw themselves in it. The night of the screening arrived. The theater buzzed with energy as people filed in. Activists, lawyers, students, families. When the lights dimmed, the room fell silent. The film unfolded frame by frame, capturing the traffic stop, the fallout, the protests, the reforms. Voices. Layered over footage, hers, the officers, community members, experts. When it ended, applause erupted. People stood, clapping until their hands hurt. Tears streamed down faces. For many, the documentary wasn't just a story, It was validation. Proof that speaking up mattered. Afterward, the judge joined a panel discussion alongside the filmmakers and activists. An audience member raised her hand, voice shaking. "How do you stay hopeful?" she asked. "When everything feels so broken." The judge smiled softly, leaning closer to the microphone. "It's not about ignoring the cracks," she said. "It's about believing we can fix them. Progress isn't perfect, it's messy, painful, but it's possible, and every step counts." The room erupted in cheers again. People lingered afterward, thanking her, sharing their stories. One young woman hugged her tightly, whispering, "You've given us courage." As she left the theater that night, she felt a weight lift off her shoulders. Not because the work was done, far from it, but because she knew she wasn't alone. Change was happening. One conversation, one policy, one moment of understanding at a time. Back in the city, the officer watched the documentary too. He sat alone in his living room, the TV casting shadows across the walls. Seeing himself on screen wasn't easy. Hearing his own voice question the judge's ownership of her car stung, but he forced himself to watch it all. The reactions, the protests, the reforms. When it ended, he turned off the TV and sat in silence. Then he picked up his phone and dialed a number he'd saved weeks earlier. A counselor specializing in racial bias training answered. "I need help," he said simply. The counselor listened patiently, then scheduled their first session. Over the next few months, they worked together, unpacking years of assumptions and habits. It wasn't easy. Some days he felt defensive. Other days he felt ashamed. But slowly, he began to see things differently, to recognize biases he hadn't noticed before. At work, he applied what he learned. During traffic stops, he focused on facts, not assumptions. He greeted drivers with respect, explained procedures clearly, and avoided unnecessary questions. Colleagues noticed the change and started asking for advice. One afternoon, a rookie officer approached him nervously. "How do you stay calm?" the young man asked. "I'm scared I'll make a mistake." The officer smiled faintly. "We all make mistakes," he said. "What matters is learning from them, listening, growing." The rookie nodded, looking relieved. For the first time in months, the officer felt like he was making a difference, not just in the community but within his own ranks. As the year came to a close, the city held a ceremony to mark the progress made since the incident. Leaders unveiled plaques honoring activists, officers, and residents who had contributed to reform efforts. The judge attended, standing tall as speakers praised her leadership. The officer watched from the back of the crowd, unnoticed but present. Later, during a quiet moment, someone tapped him on the shoulder. It was the judge. She looked at him, her expression unreadable for a second. Then she extended her hand. "Thank you," she said simply. He shook her hand, stunned. "For what?" "For showing up," she replied. "That's where it starts." Tears welled up in his eyes, but he blinked them away. For the first time in a long time, he felt proud, not of who he used to be, but of who he was becoming. As fireworks lit up the sky that night, the city celebrated not just progress but possibility. Mistakes had been made, lessons learned, bridges rebuilt. Life moved on, messy and complicated, but moving forward nonetheless. And somewhere, miles apart but connected by shared humanity, both the judge and the officer looked toward the horizon, ready to keep building a better tomorrow.